Welcome to Behind the Sims. At SaberSim, we're a team of professional gamblers, data scientists, and sports nerds building the best DFS optimizer and sports betting model on the market. This podcast is a behind-the-scenes look at how we do it. Every episode is an unedited recording of our team's actual conversations as we research, analyze, and iterate our way to answering the tough questions in DFS and sports betting. Whether we're answering questions like what's the best way to build your bankroll, analyzing different ways to diversify, or even building new models, we're going to share it all right here, and we aren't holding anything back. If you're ready to go deep into what it really takes to win, then this is a podcast for you.
All right, cool. So we're back here for another episode of Behind the Sims with our slider backtesting project here. Last time we were on, started to get some of the initial findings coming out there, a couple of strange little quirks that we were working through, talking through our 500,000% ROI, as it were, the namesake of the last title. So we have some more findings here today, it sounds like. So I guess, Elijah, I'll let you kind of just jump in and start talking about what we're seeing here.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. Yes, last time definitely had some pretty significant bugs in our data. I think after the last call, Matt and I got together and made some calls to how I want to parse that out and clean that data, so that way the insights are a little bit more intuitive. So we're just going to go through what we found based on that. This is not to say these are the final suggestions, I would say, and how we're going to change the app and the settings, but it's at least a step in the direction of what we'd like to do in the end. So just to start off, I wanted to see the distribution of slate sizes that were in our data set. Because something that's part of our analysis is going to be obviously bucketing the contest based on the slate size. I just wanted to see what slates were popular and which weren't in our data set. It looked like the vast majority were 9-game slates, which is just something that I was keeping in mind. And there was nothing larger than 15, which I think makes sense in the MLB for this season. And yeah, actually looks like there was no 8-game slates, no 9-game slates, which was interesting. So then as another layer, not just looking at the slate size, obviously we wanted to look at the optimal performance within SaberSim's predefined buckets. And so I want to see the sample size of what those look like. Just because when we draw a conclusion in our analysis, and if we say, in a 150 max, 50,000 person contest, these settings are the best, we want to see, okay, well, how many sample, what was our sample size in determining that conclusion? So this is just a visual for me. I know for those of you listening to this podcast can't see this right now, but there's pretty varied frequencies in terms of the bucket as well as slate size here. And this was just something I was using in my analysis.
Real quick, I was just going to jump in.
Sure.
So right off the bat, no slate sizes of 9 games in the data set.
Yeah, does that seem off to you guys? I don't know if that was a red flag on my end, but
feels a little weird to me. I mean, Matt, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't run the entire season. So I think it's probably just ran. It's not like we ran every single slate. I think we talked about doing that at some point, but
gotcha.
It just ended up not really being viable. So this is I think we had around 40 to 45 slates total.
Yeah.
And so this is including, early turbo night slates, stuff like that, but then also the main slates. I think there's probably happened to not
just be known. Yeah.
Be many. I'm actually I'm kind of curious as why that is, but I mean, just looking at real quick kind of the data, it looks like I guess the August 1st slate was 9 games. No, there definitely are 9-game slates, but I think probably just for whatever reason, the date ranges that I chose, they didn't have many. So
yeah. Weird.
And then on the next slide, real quick, I just wanted to get a closer look here.
Sure.
So can you talk a little bit again, just visually what we're actually seeing here?
Sorry, yeah, that's probably a good point. Just pause here for a moment. So as you can see on the x-axis, I'm trying to describe this as well as I can. There's a number followed by underscore and then another number. So the first number is the SaberSim bucket tag, and then the following number is the slate size. And just to for my reference, sort of in the appendix here, I had like just a dictionary of
I see.
SaberSim's buckets and then like what defines that bucket. And in the analysis later, I have much more details on like what those buckets are. This is just for me to see, are there any insane outliers? And if so, I dig into like what was going on there.
Got it.
Yeah, if that makes sense to you. So like, for example, here you see 10_10 plus, that's a SaberSim 10 bucket on a 10 plus game slate. So like if I had to go see what that was, like I'd go to a 10 game or SaberSim 10 bucket, and that's a 3 max with 1,000 to 10,000. Just like that's what we were looking at there. Yeah, not like super important, but yeah, feel free to cut me off if you guys have any questions about anything. So then so from the last time when we saw super astronomical ROIs and sort of weird behavior, we decided to do a few things to clean our data, which was one, only looking at GPPs that have at least 100 entrants in them. We also dropped all builds that had a sim precision setting of 0. We weren't exactly sure what was causing this, but there was some pretty weird behavior when the sim precision was 0. Which meant that it was using all of the sims in determining the lineup. So for whatever reason, the jump from 0 to 1 was a really big deal in our analysis in terms of noise.
Just real quick with that. I think that was actually not about the sim precision itself. It was that there were some slates where we had like it was a weird bug where we ran the sim a bunch of times, but like we didn't reset the results, and so we would keep like increasing the winnings of these. So like those 500,000 ROI lineups is essentially we kept simming it and increasing the winnings every time we simmed it, but like not removing the entry fee. So we ended up like with all these lineups that banked 10,000 times in 5,000 sims or whatever, like these impossible results. And it was because we just like we started with sim precision 0 in like the loop of the settings, and for some reason some of them like basically it was just like the sim precision 0 was just not actually the cause. It was just those happened to be the ones that had that bug where it like reran. So I think the latest data that I had stored for you doesn't have that, so we probably could add the sim precision 0 back in if we wanted to. I think it's fine in this case because it doesn't seem like I don't think that's going to be like the optimal for most of these, but I think we can try to add that back in and just look at it.
Yeah, and the new data is like super easy for me to work with, so I'm happy to add that in and like rerun this. It'll take like not a lot of time at all. And then after we cleaned for these two things, and then anything that was remaining that had an ROI of greater than 500%, we dropped, and that wasn't totally arbitrary. I plotted a histogram of the ROIs, which I'll pull up here. This is after dropping everything over 500, but I was noticing like a few outliers that were beyond 500%, and everything to the left of it looked more like this. So that was just sort of an intuitive outlier to drop. So this is what the distribution of the mean ROIs looked like across all builds, all slates, like all buckets. And this is just useful to look at, useful to know, because when I go through the numbers of what was actually determined optimal, like these aren't expected ROIs, just the relative performance of them is very important. So I just want to show this as like the distribution of them, so that way the numbers and the analysis make more sense. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So kind of the median or like mode or whatever is like 100% ROI, but that's of course assuming like that if that's assuming that the sims are perfect. Right. Yeah. So if you're building lineups with SaberSim, and if our sims are like the actual true representation of all the probabilities of these events happening, if it's perfect sims, then essentially like 100% ROI is like the most common outcome. Obviously, the sims aren't perfect because no sims can be perfect. So you basically can like subtract probably divide the ROI by some amount to get like the actual like expected ROI. Who knows? I don't really know what that number is, but it's more about the relative ROI than the actual.
No sims are perfect except for the tennis model. That's
exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Apparently.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, I thought this is useful just to show the distribution of what we were seeing. It'd probably be interesting, Matt, to like normalize these and like a further analysis. And I didn't really think to do that, but that could be interesting as like a next step. So yeah, so then in terms of determining what the optimal build settings are, we obviously need a metric to say, okay, this means it's optimal, and we decide to land on the mean portfolio ROI. Something else we were looking at was the omega ratio, and we can sort of get into what that is and why that matters as we go through this.
Yeah, and just I just
yeah.
want to quickly like reiterate with the reason that we're doing this is essentially our goal with the default settings is to create like an entire lineup pool that is where like all of the lineups are, high EV. The goal isn't to like create a diversified lineup pool necessarily. I think we'll be working on tools in the future that will like help to create diversified lineup sets from your pool. But basically, like the goal of the pool is to like create, good lineups, and so that's why we care the most about just the like mean ROI. But yeah, omega ratio is essentially a way to measure like riskiness. It's kind of like the risk of total loss is measured much more strongly here, and so basically like if two build settings have very similar mean ROIs but one has a much higher omega ratio, we'll go with that because that means it's a much more like diversified, less risky lineup pool. So basically all else equal, we want less risk, but what we care about the most is just like ROI.
And it's of the entire lineup pool. It's
of the entire pool, not the sorted by Saber score or anything. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That makes sense. So I guess we can just get into this now. So I've determined from the data what the actual optimal build settings were for each bucket for slate sizes 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 to 9, and then 10 plus. This method of finding the optimal build settings was sort of the original idea Matt and I had, which was just what combination of settings led to the highest mean ROI. Like just what was the single combination of them that led to the highest ROI. So that was the initial attempt at doing this. And so, I mean, we can talk about if these numbers make sense to you guys, if there's anything that's is weird to you. I think something that's worth noting before we get into this is I remember on the last podcast, Matt or Jordan, you guys were talking about how ownership is maybe a strange metric or not a setting to look at here because the sims themselves already incorporate the slate size into ownership. I remember there was something we were talking about there that I'm not sure if you guys recall what I'm talking about.
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it was there's a few different aspects here. So one is that the ownership is based on our ownership projections, but if the ownership projections are far off from actual ownership, then like it's going to have a much different effect than if the ownership projections are very accurate. We feel we're confident in our ownership projections, especially with like a lot of the recent changes that the team has made. But that is one thing, is that like it's unlike correlation, like ownership is directly related to the contest, and the other thing is like the way that ownership interacts with the builder does depend on slate size as well, because like it's kind of relative ownership. Each player essentially gets like adjusted relative to the average like ownership of that position. So on a big slate size, the average ownership of that position is smaller, and so like in a way, right now I think in the app we do increase ownership fade the smaller the slate, and I think it's possible that we'll see what these results say, but that doesn't really, it's possible that doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's sort of already incorporating that. Yeah, we can just get into it a little bit.
Yeah, I don't know. Would it be helpful for us to see a couple different buckets first, or do you want to just kind of start talking about like this one?
I think what we should.
Matt, you go.
Yeah, I mean, Elijah and I talked about this a little bit, and so I think what maybe we should do is let's summarize what we talked about before Elijah off this call, because basically like we were kind of going over these numbers a little bit yesterday or a couple days ago, and it's like pretty clear. You can show some other slides as well, but like there's some weird findings
Yeah,
here.
like,
Where like the trends don't, like in this one where it's 10 ownership is the best build at slate size 7 to 9, and then it goes to 0 at 10 plus, doesn't really make
Yeah.
much sense.
Yeah.
yeah,
And some like weird like drop offs where it's like 9 precision and then 1 and then 5.
yeah,
Like it's kind of these weird things, and I think we've talked about this a little bit in other calls, but I think there is a little bit of variance here in terms of
Oh
like,
yeah.
we're running 21, even though we're running a ton of sims, we're running like 2100 different combinations of build settings, I think. Well, I guess not, it's like 1100, but like for the higher sim position, we're running multiple, but yeah, say 1100 different combinations of build settings. Like the one that is the best out of those 1100, it seems like there could be a little bit of just randomness there of like, oh, this happened to
yeah,
just be like a good build because of how we're sampling the sims and everything, and to pull out like the optimal build settings out of like all these 1100 builds by just selecting one set of settings doesn't, I think, doesn't make a ton of sense, and is like there's too much variance in that despite all the sims. And so
Yeah.
what Elijah's mentioned before and that I wanted him to look at was to kind of like smooth out the data a little bit, and like let's look at the top 10% of like, so we have our 1100 different combinations of the builds of the sliders. Let's look
yeah,
at like the top 10% by ROI and see like what's the average like numbers there. And Elijah, if you want to get into that, I mean,
yeah,
yes, let's just get into that, because like
yeah,
basically the
sure.
other tables up there are like, I think they're interesting and there's some things that we can dig into, but like
Yeah.
there's clearly a lot of like kind of randomness there. So
Yeah, there's a lot of noise
we
in
can
that
get
one.
into this a little bit. Yeah.
Sure. Jordan, sorry, what were you gonna say?
No, that sounds good. I was gonna like that was the first thing I noticed is like it seems like there are weird like drop
Yeah.
offs and things like that. So
Yeah, and that's what's frustrating because like Matt and I were connecting. Like, is there a problem with the sim logic? Like, when there isn't. I just think it's a function of just the high variance nature of how these sims work. So like because of that, we thought a better approach would be, as Matt was saying, not just look at the top performing combination of builds, but look at the top 10% performing builds for that bucket and slate size, and then just average the build settings to a single number. So I think these numbers look like they make a bit more sense to me. There's like a general positive upwards trend in correlation. For example, bucket 3, which is a single entry contest with 100 to 1,000 entries. Like correlation seems to start at 1 and kind of increases steadily to about 6, and then kind of comes down in larger slate sizes. You get to 7 to 9 and 10 plus, which I thought to be a little weird. And that's
Yeah.
oddly a trend that continues like across most buckets, which at exactly 6, correlation seems to level off, which I don't know if that's also noise in the data, but this was something that I saw quite a bit.
yeah, I mean,
yeah, I mean,
could,
just on sorry, go ahead, Jordan.
no, you go first because I think we might be saying the same thing.
I think probably not, because what I was going to say was a bit more, was just knowing how the builder works. What that indicates to me is more about, I mean, there could be a logical reason for it, like a logical game theory reason. What that indicates to me is that maybe it's something that we should look into on the builder side and like the builder code itself, that there's something about, because basically how especially with the new like upside correlation that we use, like the higher the correlation weight, like that's kind of treating correlation differently in terms of how lineups are being built. And when it's set really high, we're like really focusing on correlation way more than the actual sim scores. And I wonder if basically like we should shift the, I mean, and this complicates what we're setting the slider defaults to, but I'm just kind of brainstorming here, like if it's dropping off like that at every single bucket, I almost wonder if like maybe correlation above 6 is actually just like, once you get above that, you're kind of losing value because you have more correlation than, like 6 is as much correlation as you need basically, and once you get over that, it's like you're already getting strong stacks. You don't really at that point you're essentially just like losing the value of like these sims and the projections relative to correlation.
Yeah.
That would be my theory. What were you going to say, Jordan?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes some sense. I was trying to think if there was kind of more of a game theory reason for why that might be. I mean, I do think you said it's like this for all buckets though, like even a larger field contest and things like that.
So let's just see, like I made some just visuals to make this make more sense. So like a bucket 9, which is 3 max, 100 to 1,000 at once the slate size is bigger than 6, it comes down at about 5.5. Let's just see a bigger one. Like bucket 15. Oh, this is still like just higher entries. So yeah, for something like a 1,000 to 10,000 20 max, like it comes up to like 6.5 correlation, but it's always at slate size 6. Like the second the slate size gets to be larger than 6, it seems like more correlation is worse, which is pretty strange to me. But I'll
Wait,
see
sorry, could
this.
you go back to this? So just to make sure I'm understanding this graph.
Yeah,
So the x-axis, so we have the same bucket, which is the 20 max, 1,000 to 10,000 entries.
yeah,
The underscore, the number to the right of the underscore is the number of games on the slate, right?
yes, exactly. So just
Okay.
6 is the slate size, but it also happened to be. I didn't want to cut you off, but yes, the 6 was the slate size I was talking about. But it did happen to be that the correlation was around like 6.5 always at its max.
Okay.
Sorry if that was unclear.
Yeah, I think I was mixing it up when I was talking
Yeah.
before. I was thinking that the correlation being above 6 is what went down, but it was the slate size being bigger
Yeah,
led
it's the slate
to
size.
smaller correlation. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah,
Well,
so
I guess ignore what I just said
yeah.
earlier then.
But
Sorry about
but
that.
you weren't totally wrong in that.
Yeah.
Like the correlation was never finding itself above 6.5, 7. So like
Right.
yeah. But yeah, the analysis I was getting at was more the slate size. Sorry, George.
I mean, I was kind of thinking that maybe at correlation 6, we start to get to the right kind of like macro correlations of like lineup construction. Like we get 5-3 stacks, 5 stacks, 5, and above and beyond that, it starts to. And I think this is kind of maybe what you were saying, Matt. Like it starts to overvalue micro correlations of like batting order and like that kind of stuff. And maybe it just doesn't. It's not enough of a factor that it moves the needle beyond that. Because I think I was just going to run a build too and just see like if we run builds at like 6, do you kind of like is that enough to get the like traditional lineup constructions that you'd want?
Yeah. And I think in terms of the slate size thing, I mean, again, I do think it is odd to me that lower correlation at bigger slate sizes is more optimal. One thing could just be like at really big slate sizes, there's just more edge in the projections, and so you just want to like lean into the projections more than the correlation. But it's just it's definitely not intuitive. So okay, so this is the biggest bucket here. So like
so the
150,
biggest
this is the
one,
big flagship GPP, which is I think, even though this is like only one of the buckets, I would say this is the one that we like care about the most probably. Because this is like the mini max, this is the big flagship, this is like the biggest contest.
And here we're seeing, I would say, a weird jump when the slate size is 4 in terms of correlation being the highest at like 8.5. But other than that, I would say it's a pretty like just positive trend in terms of correlation and slate size. And so I dug into this one a little bit further because I had a feeling that this was one that we'd be interested in talking about. So where is it? I looked at, so just to reiterate this, like when I say that a SaberSim bucket 23, slate size 4, these are the optimal ones. Like these numbers are the function of lots of individual builds that made this average value of 8.47. So I plotted like what these would look like in terms of what are the actual correlation settings that went into that value of like 8.5 versus whatever was at the highest one, like 5.87. And I don't know if this is worth looking into, but like during a 4-game slate, this is where we saw 8 correlation being 8.5 is like in the top 90th percentile. What's interesting is that the only correlation settings that were within the top 10% of this build had correlation values at 8, 9, and 10. Which
that feels like this feels like a bug territory to me.
So I
the
think
fact
so
that
as
there was
well.
only like I almost
Yeah.
wonder if like the builds, if we have a small sample of slates at this 4-game size, and for some reason like we like didn't run all the builds or something, and so we don't even have builds at the lower correlations, because I think one thing we should do, which we can't do this on like this call, but we should probably just like ignore any contests where we don't have the full set of, like, if there's anything where for some reason something errored out and we only say have like 500 builds for the contest, you know, we should just do that entirely, because obviously we're going to get skewed results if we only have like the 8, 9, 10 correlation.
So yeah, I agree with you, but in this case, like this is saying in the top 10% of builds, these were the only 3 settings that were present. So I like, yes, I think, and so it's possible in this analysis to find like a subset of the build options, but I looked into why this was just 8, 9, and 10. And in this specific case, it was because I mentioned that we dropped any builds that resulted in a mean ROI of greater than 500%, and all the builds in this bucket that had a correlation figure that was lower than 8 all had greater than 500% ROI. So that was why.
So this is like an error.
Yes,
there's something wrong with this bucket.
Yes, but it wasn't immediately concerning to me that only 8, 9, and 10 were there, because it's again like the top 10% of builds. So it's possible that like every combinations in the top 10% had either 8, 9, 10 correlations. That wasn't immediately alarming to me, but I did look into it, and it is like a bug in the ROI.
Okay, so we can ignore this bucket, but we should like figure out why, because that bug I thought was kind of fixed in like the newer data that was.
It's possible. This is on the older data, so I'm happy to. It's
this is on the older. Okay.
Yeah, because the newer data
so we can
only had 30 something slates.
Right.
But yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and then this looks better to me. Like this is the top 10% of builds in a like flagship GPP, basically. And these look more normal to me, like in terms of
so this is the top 10%. Interesting.
So these are the counts.
So even though the average is like 5 point something or 6.7 for correlation, like there's more correlation 10 builds in like the top 10% of settings than any other correlation.
Which I thought would be cool to look into. Yeah, and like it's funny, there's like 0 is better than 2, so like there's some pretty interesting things that I was seeing here. But again, we spoke about this last time, these settings are not independent, right? So like this analysis should be taken with a grain of salt. Just something to keep in mind. I remember something you guys were talking about last time, and so yeah.
And it drops off like under 6 too, is what I'm seeing as well. Like there's a drop on correlation, and precision. But correlation, like there's a drop there. But kind of, not really actually, I guess, because 3 and 4 are in that like more successful.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's a drop, like 0, 1, and 2. There's kind of a drop, but then like almost anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I was experimenting with some builds right off the bat, and it does seem like what I said was like pretty true. That like I wonder how far I could take this. Like even at correlation 5. Instantly 5-3, 5-2, 4-3, 4-4. Like you get the stacks you expect.
And is that for the top saber score or for like the pool?
That's for top saber score. For pool,
because it does make sense that like it would. Yeah. Okay.
By far.
So yeah, I mean,
Like I wonder.
And what site slate is this that you're
It's
looking
today's
at?
slate, 8 game slate.
Okay.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
So I think it's very possible that it's like you don't really need correlation above 6. Is what.
we're losing you a little bit here, Matt.
There we go.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. We hear you now.
What I would expect is that intuitively is that like on a smaller slate, I mean, not even small, like mid-sized slate, even like 8 games, that maybe 6 is all you need, but for like a 15-game slate, you would kind of need higher correlation in order to get, at least in order to get those stack types, like the 5-3 that
Sure.
people want. Which I guess kind of when you're showing like, there were a more correlation 10, but here's a 6-game slate.
Sorry, I'll go
back
back
to that
here.
6-game
Yeah, I'll
slate.
go back. Yeah, 20 max, like mid-size contest, 6-game slate.
It's still like 879 is pretty high up there.
Yeah.
So what I would probably, my first thoughts here is that this is like too many builds. Like top 10% is too many. Like obviously before the initial findings were just taking one build, right?
Yeah.
Like the top build out of 1100 or 1200. This is taking a lot. I mean, so yeah, I guess we're running like over 2000. So this is top 10% is taking like 200, which
Yeah.
I'm a little bit confused actually about the y-axis here because this looks like a lot more than 200.
Yeah.
I guess because there's multiple slates and stuff, so
exactly.
It's
yeah.
It's like 2000 builds times however many
Yeah.
contests and slates that we're running.
Mhm.
But I feel like taking the top 5% or even the top 1%
Mhm.
and looking at the averages there might be
Yeah.
better because we would have enough builds to smooth out the results, but we're still like when we're looking at so many, especially when you're looking at that 10 plus game,
Yeah.
like the highest bucket, highest number of games. It was like the 10 correlation had like 350 builds.
Yeah.
It just seemed like there's too many, and so when we're
Yeah.
averaging out all those numbers, they kind of just like the average ownership, for example, was like 5 for every single
always 5
thing,
Yeah.
right? And what that indicates is
across
just
the
like
board.
ownership doesn't matter because the average ownership of all the builds is going to be 5 because it's 0 through 10. And so basically like ownership doesn't like all of the builds.
Yeah.
It was just random ownership. But I wonder if we take the top like 1% of the build settings, because the goal is like, let's find the best combination of settings, but like not have that variance aspect. So I would probably want to do this data smoothing, but like for top 5% and top 1% and see what that looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could do that. Yeah, that's pretty straightforward. I just chose 10% as like I thought this was like a baseline, should smooth things out a bit.
No, that definitely makes sense. And like clearly like the trends we're seeing here, I think make a lot more sense than what you were showing before. Obviously there's like this slate size 4. I feel like let's just ignore the slate size 4 because clearly that has some kind of issue. But like beyond that, it's like correlation should be lower on smaller slates and bigger on bigger slates generally. Ownership doesn't seem to impact much, which is I think really interesting. Not necessarily like a little bit weird, but like it seems possible. Maybe we're just like ownership is not, or maybe just the ownership fade slider accounts for the slate size enough anyway that like
that's what I was thinking.
Changing it, like maybe either it's random and it just averages out to 5, or 5 is really just sort of like a good number no matter what the. But I don't know about that. And then precision. I mean, there's not a big trend. I feel like some of the other tables there was a bigger trend in precision.
Like,
but
let me pull that up.
The thing about precision though that I think it's kind of interesting is that like, some of what Precision is doing is diversifying the pool, which is not what we're measuring here.
Mhm.
Right. So obviously we are taking smaller sim buckets, which kind of impacts the upside of the lineup pool, but the other part of what Precision is doing is creating a more diversified, it's like a pseudo randomness setting in terms of like higher precision will give you a more diversified pool. But since what we're measuring is mean ROI, like kind of want a it makes sense that it kind of equal like the equilibrium or whatever is 6 or 7 because that you're getting the impact of the individual. So there's some banging going on somewhere. You're getting the
Sorry,
impact
that's
of
me.
the individual sims a bit more,
Yeah.
but not having so much randomness that you're decreasing your like mean portfolio ROI. So it kind of seems like that sweet spot, but it almost feels like one, increasing sim precision could be partly a preference, a user preference thing, where it's like increase it to get a more diversified pool if you want to
Yeah.
lower your risk a little bit.
But there's no like clear
yeah.
ROI like connect. Yeah, it's probably it could just be a
Right.
user preference thing, which I think could be interesting to explore. But yeah, it's fine. Now I'm thinking about it. Like, even though the newer data only has like 30 something slates, not 46, I think like if that bug is fixed and I'm using this data smoothing technique and not just taking the one maximum, I think like that data is actually going to be a lot more insightful as we're like talking about this. So that seems like a really good like next step here, I think.
The other thing I'm thinking about, Elijah, is for these results, you're sort of averaging it across all the contests and slates that we have. I mean, you're dividing by the bucket or whatever, but
Yeah.
I wonder if we should be like, say you have 10-game slates, and like one of them, the Saber Sim projections are like pretty far off the field, and the other one, the Saber Sim projections are like very similar to the field. I think for the one where the Saber Sim projections are very far off, the ROIs are going to be a lot higher because basically we think there's a lot more like edge because we think the field is wrong. So we think the expected ROI is going to be higher. And so like that slate is going to be just like all of those builds are going to be brought to the top when we take this top X%.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like what we should be doing is like individualizing this analysis by slate, and then we can kind of average those results. But like just combining all these different slates, I think like if it's what we care about more is like the ROI relative to like the slate, not relative to all builds across all slates. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Like that's a great idea. I think that would be really insightful because like in the data smoothing that I'm doing now, like it's possible that like exactly you're only looking at the performance of the builds from like one of like 5 contests where just like similar builds did very well and you're neglecting everything else. So I think that
exactly. Where it's like this, we think that this field is like really fishy, and like, you know, some pitcher is going to be like is 60% owned and we hate that pitcher, and so like basically all the builds for that contest are the top of the ROI because we just like disagree. So yeah, I think that's probably having a pretty big impact.
For sure.
I would say like the top
from each slate.
Yeah, I mean each contest.
Yeah, I was funny. The only reason why I said slate and not contest was because getting the way the data is stored, getting the contest ID is going to be a little bit weird. But yeah, I think you're right. I think for each contest, it would be like the best way to do
so
this.
The approach that I'm thinking of is we find the top whatever percent, maybe 5%, say
Mhm.
the top 5% of builds by ROI for each contest individually, and
Yeah.
then we take those numbers
Yeah.
and do the analysis on those, and so then we have like our buckets. So like we have the average build settings for the top 5%
Yeah.
of lineups of builds for each contest, and then we say, okay, like let's look at all of the contests that fit this bucket,
Yeah.
and let's see like what do the average build settings look like. So we're
Yeah.
like sort of taking the average of the averages.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think doing it that way is like, then we know we have like data from each contest rather than
Mhm.
just taking them all from one.
Yeah, because we're probably only using one contest in a lot of these, just because of the nature of like. Yeah, I think this is great. This
Yeah.
also takes care of a lot of that sim bias, and that we were talking
Yeah.
about, where it'll really overweight one contest if like we just nailed that contest, or vice versa. So yeah, I think that sounds great to me as like a next step here.
Would that potentially give us an opportunity to kind of like redraw the lines for the actual buckets we use in the app then?
That's like another step, I would say. Matt,
Yeah, I
right?
would say
Like,
that what we
Okay.
should do first is like let's change the defaults given the current buckets. But I mean, I think our goal was to redraw the lines a little bit. But I would like to, like, given the current buckets, I would like to get some changes in there. I mean, I'm almost tempted to, like, I know we're not done with this, but I'm tempted to just globally lower the correlation for all MLB builds based on this data.
Yeah.
It feels to me, looking at this, that like we should basically be like, I think the average correlation is at 8 for like most big slates, I think, right now in the app, and I kind of want to set it to 6. I know that's not like the most science, like we're still kind of in this process, but it feels what the data is showing us is like correlation is probably. I mean, I'm going to dig into this a little bit after this. I'm not going to make that decision right now, but it feels like that might be an immediate win, because like obviously we're doing this, we want to get like the scientific good answer, but like I want our users to like get good lineups like right away. Like I don't want, if we know that there's some flaw in the default settings, I don't want to like wait on that. I want to just like implement it, even if it's something small. But I'll kind of think about that and maybe chat with you again, Elijah, about this data. But that's what I'm kind of thinking, like right off the bat, is like lower correlation a little bit by default for MLB. Not a lot, but especially since like, clearly correlation at 6 even gives you pretty strong stacks. And maybe precision as well, but I want to look into the data a little bit more. But I think what we said about like, so that last idea of kind of averaging out the individual contests is good. Let's use, even though the new data has fewer slates, I think try using that as well, because I think it fixes some of the bugs that we saw. And then what else were we going to do? Maybe I'll try to run some sims on, try to find some 9-game slates, or just like, I mean, we ran a lot of these builds like we've been doing this series for like a month, so like maybe I'll run some from the past like 2 or 3 weeks, because we haven't done any of those, and just run some sims, since they'll have all of our like improvements on our model and any ownership improvements. Like we know that they're kind of like up to date. Just to get some more data in there.
Sounds good.
And but I mean, I feel like pretty good about where we're at here. I think these are some interesting results, and like we're pretty close to kind of getting to the finish line here.
Yeah, agreed. It definitely feels like we're getting close. I was thinking like about what we're doing here, and I was trying to like think about it in my head. So the change we're making now is we're going to like measure this information on an individual contest level, and then like average that.
I mean, right. Essentially, like it's going to be, the results I think are going to look the same. It's just right now we're taking so like in this bucket, we have 20 max, 1,000 to 10,000 entries.
Mhm.
We're basically taking all builds across that, all builds for all slates that fit, and then like the sims of those builds. Sorry, I'm not explaining this well, but essentially we're taking like the top 10%, but like all of the top 10% might be from one slate or one contest, because like we're just sorting by ROI, and so we're taking the
Right.
top 10% by ROI, but that might be unrelated to the build settings. It might be more just related to, we think that the field in this specific contest is weak, and so and we don't want to measure that. What we want to measure is like the relative build settings, and so we want to like take for each individual contest, what are the top build settings, and then of those, each of those contests, then let's take the averages. Then we know that we're including data from every single contest that we're simming, and we're saying
Yes. Okay.
on average, these build settings led to the highest ROI independent of the contest that you're entering. Because obviously, I think the optimal build settings might differ based on each individual contest depending on how soft it is, right? But like we're not going to incorporate that into the default settings because that's just a very complex thing. So maybe it's like, oh, the softer the field, like if you think that you have a ton of projection edge, you might want to use like lower ownership fade, because like you just want to like really
Right.
lean into like the value of the projections, right? If you think like, especially for something like a weather game or like I don't know, there's some assumption that the field is making that you think is wrong. But basically we want to say, like, independent of the context of that slate and the context of that contest, here are like the best settings, just like not knowing anything about like the contest itself. And whereas what we're seeing right now, that Elijah did, is like it's not really separating that out, because all these builds might be coming from the same slate or the same contest.
And I think that's very likely they are coming from the same contest now that we're talking about this. Because like you will have, like what I saw in the data was like you'll have a contest with an insanely high ROI pretty much regardless of the build settings, just because we were pretty different from the fields. So yeah, that was a good catch, Matt. I think that was something
that makes sense.
Yeah.
It feels more in line with like the actual way that people like play DFS and use the app. Like they're playing their contests every day, regardless of what the individual edges are on like that.
Right. And that's how we want to set the default settings anyway.
Right.
Is like, this is just the default settings. Like users can make their own adjustments if they feel like this specific situation lends itself to different settings, but like we're just setting up the starting point. And that's really the goal of this project. So yeah.
Cool.
Sweet.
I'm excited to see what comes out of that. What's the time frame that are we thinking to like do that?
Like from my end, the changes we just described don't seem too bad. I think I could definitely by early next week that'll be wrapped up, if not by like tomorrow. The only thing in the back of my head that I'm questioning, Matt, maybe we'll need to connect on this, is like how to identify each build's contest ID. Because the way in which it's stored in the cloud right now, I know it's in the file name, I want to say, but actually, no, I think there's a way. As I'm talking about it, I think I figured out a way. But that's the only thing that I see stuff like slowing me down. But yeah, I think I know how to do that. But yeah, early next week, this is all the infrastructure's there, so it's pretty easy just to like update the data and change the percentile threshold that I'm going to consider for an average. So like, yeah, I don't see this being too bad.
Okay, sweet, cool. So yeah, we can kind of regroup early next week then.
Perfect.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks, guys.
All right.
See ya.
Everyone.